The entire ballroom fell silent when my mother raised her champagne glass, pointed directly at me, and smiled. Then she said the 7 words that destroyed 28 years of pretending we were a family. I only have one daughter, and she's standing beside me. More than 300 guests applauded awkwardly while I stood frozen near the back of the room. I quietly picked up my purse and started walking toward the exit. That's when an elderly 4-star admiral stood from his table, his voice trembling as he called my name. Within minutes, the entire celebration had become something nobody there would ever forget. My name is Rebecca Carter, and I'm 39 years old. People often assume the deepest wounds come from strangers. In my experience, they usually come from the people who taught you what the word family was supposed to mean. Growing up, I always believed if I worked a little harder, earned better grades, or made fewer mistakes, my parents would finally look at me the way they looked at my younger sister, Ashley. They never did. Ashley was the center of every celebration. Every birthday felt bigger. Every achievement deserved another family dinner, and every small success became a story my parents proudly told their friends. I wasn't ignored completely. I was simply expected. Expected to help. Expected to understand. Expected not to complain. When I graduated high school with honors, my parents congratulated me before changing the conversation to Ashley's upcoming dance recital. When college tuition arrived, I worked 2 part-time jobs, took out student loans, and graduated without asking anyone for financial help. Ashley attended a private university with every expense covered. Whenever I questioned the difference, my mother always gave the same answer. You're stronger than your sister. At first, I accepted that as praise. Eventually, I realized it was just another excuse. After college, I made a decision that surprised almost everyone. I joined the United States Navy. It wasn't because I wanted adventure. It was because I wanted to build a life where effort mattered more than favoritism. The Navy gave me exactly that. Discipline, purpose, responsibility. Over the next 17 years, I served as a logistics officer, leading teams through demanding assignments that required calm decisions under pressure. The work wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Every successful mission depended on thousands of details being handled correctly, and I took pride in making sure they were. During deployments, birthdays came and went without family phone calls. Promotions were acknowledged with short text messages. Sometimes, weeks passed before either of my parents returned my calls. I stopped expecting much. Life became quieter that way. Then, completely out of the blue, an elegant cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was an invitation to Ashley's engagement gala. Black tie. 5-star hotel. Over 300 guests expected. At the bottom, my mother's handwriting read, "It would mean a lot if you came." I stared at those words for a long time. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe something had changed. Maybe they wanted to start over. Maybe this was finally our chance to become the family I'd spent my entire life hoping for. So, I bought Ashley a thoughtful engagement gift, rented an evening gown, and drove to the ballroom carrying something far heavier than the wrapped box in my hands. I carried hope. I had no idea it was about to be tested the moment I walked through those doors. The ballroom was even more extravagant than I had imagined. Crystal chandeliers stretched across the ceiling, fresh white roses covered nearly every table, and a string quartet played softly in the corner while waiters moved effortlessly through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne. Everything about the evening whispered luxury. I adjusted the ribbon on Ashley's gift box and walked inside with a smile. For a brief moment, I thought maybe I'd arrived early enough to have a quiet conversation with my parents before the guests became too busy. Instead, my mother walked straight past me. She wrapped Ashley in a hug, kissed her cheek, and began introducing her to another group of guests without even acknowledging I had entered the room. I stood there for several seconds before quietly making my way toward the refreshments. Throughout the evening, I watched my parents proudly introduce Ashley to investors, family friends, and business associates. Our beautiful daughter. Our pride and joy. Our greatest blessing. Every introduction ended exactly the same way. No one introduced me. A few guests smiled politely, assuming I was a coworker helping with the event. One woman handed me her empty champagne glass and thanked me for my excellent service. I simply smiled, placed the glass on a nearby tray, and walked away. Correcting her somehow felt more embarrassing than staying silent. Ashley noticed me once or twice across the room. She looked like she wanted to say something, but every time, another guest pulled her into another conversation. I told myself not to take it personally. This night was about her. Then the master of ceremonies invited everyone to take their seats for the engagement toast. The room settled into a comfortable silence. My father stood first. He spoke proudly about Ashley's kindness, her future, and how she had always brought joy into their lives. The audience applauded warmly. Then my mother stepped forward with her champagne glass. She smiled at Ashley before slowly turning toward the rest of the ballroom. "There is something I'd like everyone here to know," she said. Her eyes found mine near the back of the room. She pointed directly at me. "I only have one daughter." She placed her free hand on Ashley's shoulder. "And she's standing right here beside me." A stunned silence swept through the ballroom. Then, unsure of what else to do, a few guests began clapping. My face burned with embarrassment. Without saying a single word, I placed my untouched drink on the nearest table, picked up my purse, and started walking toward the exit. I had almost reached the doors when a deep, weathered voice echoed across the ballroom. "Commander Rebecca Carter." I stopped instantly. Every conversation died. Slowly, an elderly man wearing a dark navy blazer decorated with military pins rose from his chair. His eyes filled with tears as he looked directly at me. And suddenly, every person in that ballroom turned to see why a four-star admiral was calling my name. I turned slowly. The elderly gentleman was already making his way toward me, his movements steady despite his age. His silver hair was neatly combed, and the rows of ribbons on his blazer quietly hinted at a lifetime of extraordinary service. When he reached me, he didn't offer a handshake. He wrapped me in a warm embrace. "It's good to see you again, Commander Carter," he said, his voice trembling. "Far too long." For a second, I couldn't speak. "Admiral Hayes," I finally whispered. "I didn't know you were coming." He smiled through moist eyes. "I was invited by the groom's grandfather." "I had no idea you were part of this family." The ballroom had become completely silent. My parents stood frozen beside the microphone. Ashley looked back and forth between us, completely confused. The Admiral slowly turned toward the guests. "I apologize," he said politely, "but after what I just heard, I can't remain silent." No one interrupted him. "I served in the Navy for over 40 years, he continued. "I've met thousands of officers, commanded fleets, and watched remarkable men and women dedicate their lives to serving others." He looked directly at me. "Commander Rebecca Carter is one of the finest leaders I've ever had the privilege of serving beside." A wave of whispers moved through the room. The Admiral took a slow breath before continuing. "Several years ago, after a devastating hurricane struck the Gulf Coast, entire communities were cut off from food, medicine, and clean water. Ports were damaged. Roads had disappeared. Thousands of families were waiting for help." His voice became softer. "Rebecca was responsible for coordinating one of the largest emergency logistics operations our command had ever attempted." He paused, collecting himself. Failure wasn't an option. Every guest listened without moving. "For nearly 6 straight days," he said, "she barely slept. She organized transportation, redirected supplies, solved problems nobody else could solve, and kept hundreds of service members working together under impossible conditions." He looked at me with unmistakable pride. Because of her leadership, relief reached people who otherwise might have waited days longer. I lowered my eyes. "It wasn't just me, Admiral," I said quietly. "Hundreds of people worked incredibly hard." He smiled. "That's exactly what great leaders always say." A few guests nodded. Some even began applauding. The Admiral raised one hand, asking them to wait. "Do you know what impressed me most?" he asked the room. "It wasn't her intelligence. It wasn't her discipline. It was that after everything she accomplished, she declined every interview, every newspaper request, and every opportunity to put herself in the spotlight." He turned toward my parents. "You may not realize who your daughter is." Then he looked around the ballroom. But everyone in this room deserves to. The silence felt heavier than before. Just when I thought the moment couldn't become any more emotional, another voice spoke from across the ballroom. I can confirm every single word. A second retired senior officer slowly stood from his table. And suddenly, this was no longer just one admiral's story. The second retired officer walked toward the center of the ballroom with quiet confidence. I served alongside Admiral Hayes, he said. And I also had the privilege of working with Commander Carter. He smiled warmly in my direction. If you think you've only heard half the story, you're right. A few guests leaned forward in their chairs. There were countless moments when Rebecca accepted the hardest assignments without asking for recognition. She stayed after others left, made sure junior officers received the credit they deserved, and never measured success by rank or applause. He paused before adding softly, "People followed her because they trusted her." One by one, several veterans seated throughout the ballroom stood to their feet. Some saluted. Others simply applauded. Within seconds, the applause spread across the room until nearly every guest was standing. I felt overwhelmed, not because of the attention, but because the respect filling that ballroom had nothing to do with wealth, titles, or appearances. It had been earned. Across the room, my mother slowly lowered her eyes. My father looked as though he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Ashley quietly walked over and took the engagement gift from my hands. "I should have spoken to you tonight," she whispered. "I'm sorry." I smiled gently. "This was always for you." She hugged me tightly before stepping back. Then my mother approached. Her voice was almost unrecognizable. "Rebecca, please stay." She glanced around at the photographers preparing for family pictures. "We want you in the photographs." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I answered calmly, "I appreciate the invitation." I took a slow breath. But respect isn't something that appears after strangers tell you who someone is. It comes from knowing their worth long before anyone else notices. No one argued. I wished Ashley and her fiancé a lifetime of happiness, congratulated them sincerely, and quietly walked toward the ballroom doors. This time, no one tried to stop me. They simply watched me leave, finally seeing the daughter they had overlooked for far too many years. And although I walked away alone, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. 3 years passed faster than I ever expected. I retired from the Navy with a heart full of gratitude and began a new chapter, helping veterans transition into civilian careers through a leadership consulting company I founded. Watching others discover confidence beyond their uniforms became one of the most rewarding missions of my life. Then one quiet Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. It was my father. His voice sounded older.
Softer.
"Rebecca," he said after a long pause, "would you meet with your mother and me?" I agreed, not because the past had disappeared, but because carrying bitterness had never been the life I wanted. We met at a small cafe overlooking the harbor. For several minutes, none of us spoke. Finally, my mother looked at me with tears in her eyes. "We spent so many years chasing appearances," she admitted quietly. "We celebrated what impressed other people and overlooked the daughter whose character should have made us proud every single day." My father nodded. "We can't change what we did." "No," I answered gently. "None of us can." There was no dramatic apology. No perfect ending. Just honest conversation between people who had finally stopped pretending. I forgave them. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, and it didn't mean everything returned to the way it once was. Healthy boundaries remained, built not from anger but from wisdom. Today we speak more often.
Slowly.
Respectfully. And every relationship we continue to build rests on honesty instead of expectations. Looking back, I learned something I'll never forget. The loudest applause you'll ever receive means very little if the people closest to you refuse to see your worth. But character has a remarkable way of introducing itself. Eventually, the world notices. And sometimes, when you're fortunate enough, even your family finally does too.